Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Meta Forecast once more with your host, Louis Berman. We're talking today about individual skill in League. Does it still matter? And if so, how much? And maybe looking into the future as well a bit. I'm joined by Tyler Shadowvisions Deaton, mid laner of the North Carolina State University, and colorcaster himself, I think.
Correct. Just started this season. We're first place in CL Elite as well. Around Master Tier D1 mid laner. Here to provide a bit of insight.
All right. And to my, I guess, right in the overlay, although if you look at the overlay, you look at me, and in the overlay it looks like you're to my left. You know what I mean? No, never mind. It's Jesper Benvarmeren Kunz, Danish colorcaster, and not only casting
Yes.
League of Legends, but also Counter-Strike and anything else?
I also do Rocket League and Modern Combat 5, but I'm not that good in League of Legends. I'm not a Diamond 2 colorcaster. I'm only Diamond 5. I'm a bit of a scrub.
I mean,
but...
I'm unranked, but...
yes, but...
Could still be NA at Worlds.
Yeah. Kind of like that you have a different game perspective as well in here. So yeah, that's gonna be the topic for today. This discussion has been a pretty old one. Ever since we saw like the changes to snowballing, we've seen less and less solo kills over the years. But there's always been a way for people to shine in League of Legends, even in the like direst of times. But I think at least in some roles these days, there's really no standout stars anymore, especially if you look at the jungle. So I kind of want to start off with a little discussion about catch-up experience, because I feel like that's the biggest contributing factor to at least the jungle role. So Shadowvisions, what's your take on it generally?
Right. So when you look at the competitive scene and also solo queue, catch-up XP is a big problem for why tank junglers like Sejuani or Gragas are so prominent in the current meta, because even if they fall behind, you get so much catch-up XP from farming the jungle, and then you're much more impactful in teamfights. So becoming a standout jungler, either in a competitive scene or in solo queue, is more about, if you're going to play early picks that are so popular like Nidalee or Ezreal, you can't just destroy the enemy jungler. You have to destroy the enemy jungler and gank with red buff on Ezreal, kill him level 2, go to mid lane, go to bot lane, and snowball your advantage. Because if you can't do that, you will get outscaled by picks like the Sejuani.
I think a huge thing about catch-up experience is also that in solo queue, you're not necessarily as coordinated with your team as you are in professional play. It's so much easier to keep people down in professional play because you are always talking to a mid laner about invading onto the Raptors and actually trying actively to shut down the enemy's jungler.
So, goddamn, I had a point, but I just lost it. So I'm gonna shift the discussion to something else, which is basically, do you think like you can really keep down like without like putting all your effort into keeping down a jungler? Can you really do it? Like we have seen some examples of it, like Cuz in the LCK finals, but they literally played their entire game around killing Cuz. So
yes,
do you think without like putting all the effort that you can like without neglecting your lanes, basically, can you still do it?
well, I think that you can without neglecting your lanes. It's a lot about which team composition you pick, because obviously if you pick a very aggressive early game composition, it's going to be so much easier to try and shut down your enemy jungler while also keeping a tabs on how you are controlling your lanes. Because if you have a team composition that are able to roam around and actually support your jungler, it's going to be so much easier for him to invade and play so aggressive. But again, if you then have a Kog'Maw in the bottom lane with a Lulu and then an Azir in the mid lane, it's going to be so much harder to actually have that backup needed to shut down the jungler and working on the lanes as well.
Absolutely. Everything in League is a trade-off, risk versus reward. And yes, you can commit 3 pushing lanes in your draft, as well as you can play like Levi, play Kane, just sit in the enemy jungle and try and get kills, keep them down. But the question is, if the enemy team has scaling, can they make it through the early game? Can their jungler get catch-up XP eventually? You cannot keep them down for the entire game without losing advantages somewhere else in other lanes. And the question is that effort to put down the jungle better spent into other lanes that may like keep down a Kog'Maw or stop a Jace from snowballing? And if you can do that, you have an advantage in your top or mid lane. So if you can do that, it's normally better effort spent there than in the jungle.
And that's a super good point that Shadowvisions is making right here, because obviously if you then have, let's say, a Twitch in the bottom lane, you can get 2 kills onto him, then he'll help you carry the game instead of shutting down the enemy's Sejuani. If Twitch then has let's say, an Infinity Edge and a Static Shiv or Ruinous Hurricane or whatever, he will be able to deal so much damage that Sejuani, who's already behind, will not be able to really catch up in the game. So I see really what Shadowvisions is saying, and I think it's very, very true.
Yeah, I kind of heard the same like from Alestin's video about catch-up experience, where he basically said, go to the lanes, get them ahead, and then use catch-up experience to get back in the game. Don't really worry that much about your farm. And I feel like that's really true. Going to your lanes is much more effective than going to the enemy jungle most of the time. So a second point that, you know, is as old as I think season 3 is the catch-up mechanics that we had before, which is primarily the bounties. That you get less and less gold for stomping somebody in, and more gold for getting back into the game.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think do you think it goes too far? Do you think you get too much of a gold swing for just winning one team fight in the late game? Especially since, you know, winning a team fight in the late game is gonna net you a couple of objectives as well. Basically, can you play like shit until 30 minutes and then win one team fight and get back into the game? Is my question.
Well, if you watch any of TSM games at Worlds, you would say yes, it is certainly possible because they have the absolute most disgusting early game I've ever seen get 3 wins at Worlds. And, you know, if you're going to forfeit the early game like that, yes, it is kind of a problem that team fights give you so much gold back when you lose early game so hard, and that's why we're seeing so much late game scaling in the current meta, because the team fights, not only do you get gold from the team fights, that's actually not the important part. The important part is death timers get so long when the game time scales late that you can usually get, you know, if the game scales to 35 minutes, Elder Dragon is up, Baron is free to take, because if you have an Ardent Censer, you take no damage when doing Baron. So that's why you often see one pick snowball into Baron. The other team just forfeits it. There's nothing they can do, especially if you have like a Cho'Gath or a Kalista, who are both really prioritized in draft. So yeah, if you can win a late game team fight, they're absolutely like busted right now, because the death timers are so long, you get objectives, you get turrets, and you get map pressure off of that, so you win the next one as well.
I also think it's a matter of how the overall game is, because if you make a big play in the late game, you want to have a feeling of actually being rewarded off of that. So if you get to that point, let's say 35, 40 minutes, you do want to be able to get a Baron, get a few towers, and actually work from there. And yes, you shouldn't be allowed to die, let's say, 50 times before that 35-minute mark, but then if you do so, it is basically the other team's problem that they can't end the game. You shouldn't be punished by their mistakes.
All right. Another point is obviously the overabundance of like wave clear in the game. You can stall out a game for pretty long, especially if you have like these tank tops wet noodling themselves like all game and basically never getting a turret. So the question is, should there be more ways to force especially turret objectives?
Well, I think that when talking about wave clear, it's very important to realize that wave clear is an essential part of the game, because if you don't have wave clear, it's going to be so hard to really defend your towers. Should it be easier to knock down towers? I don't think so, because you already have so many different ways of doing so, and especially in this meta where tanks are so important, and essential to a team composition, you can get these tanks that actually allow you to go under the tower. You can pick up a Gnar and a Sejuani, and then you already have the few components that you need to be able to dive under a tower. So I don't think it should be easier. I just think that people should be better at recognizing when they can do so and when they can't.
I would agree with that. I would not say that, wave clear is necessarily OP in the current meta. Yes, all of the meta mid laners have it and stuff. But that's not only because wave clear is so essential to defending turrets. It's also because in order to be able to roam and make an impact on the rest of the map, snowball your lanes, you have to be able to push the mid lane wave. And if the other champion picks something that can push against you, like the Victor after he gets his hex score, you really are limited with your options in terms of roaming. Turrets are already paper if you can actually get to them. It's just a matter of having your minions under the wave. And that's why we're seeing, with the backdoor bonus, a last-ditch effort to defend is oftentimes less about killing the enemy and more about killing the minions, because wave clear is that important. The one thing I would say is that Baron is kind of the only way to deal with immense amounts of wave clear other than getting picks. And I would like to see less, power on the Baron and more power taken away from, in general, one-shotting minion waves in zoning controls, like champions like Veigar can one-shot the wave and put down their cage to zone out. I think that kind of pick would be something we could see in the meta, with the recent Veigar buffs after the Worlds patch. Definitely something, because that has so much control of siege situations, and we are seeing teams like WE recognize with the Caitlyn pick that sieges are still a valid way to win the game, especially in the scaling meta. You can pick a scaling AD carry, siege up turrets because they go down so quickly, and they take advantage of comps that are behind and need time to scale.
All right. We often see laning phases being relegated to pushing these days. Like it's less about getting kills in the lane, but getting the push to get map presence while the wave crashes into the enemy turret. So the question obviously then becomes like, of course you can make plays of that. So to some extent it is still a skillful thing. But should solo kills return to League of Legends? To the highest echelons of League of Legends, that is.
Well, you also have to keep in mind that back in Season 3, when snowballing was like on its highest point in League of Legends, it was so easy to get solo kills and then just go from there. I remember playing Draven back in Season 3, where you could get a Bloodthirster and then just add another Bloodthirster on top of that. You would have so much lifesteal, you could just stack those two items and then carry the game off of that. So I think solo kills is something that obviously you should be able to get, and you can get it in a solo queue. It's so much more risky to get it in competitive play and actually go for it in competitive play. But should it come back more? I think it very much depends on the situation.
I think it will come back more, but the reason we're not seeing it a lot right now, personally, I have not been solo killed or gotten any solo kills this season of Complete League. That just doesn't happen in the current meta. The reason why is that the mid lane meta is just champs like Ori and Syndra, champions that scale into team fight meta and can blow people up in the late game, or even Rise. You want to be able to shove, pick something like Galio or Talia and roam and get your Ardent Censer scaling AD carry a lead, and also set behind the other AD carry, because that's really what's dictating the current meta is, again, champs that can roam. And when you're trying to shove the mid lane wave, you can either use your spells, your wave clear, on the enemy or on the wave. And over time, the meta has developed to a point where it is much less of a question and more of just shoving the wave, because it's just the trade-off is not worth it right now unless you are significantly better than your opponent.
And that is a huge problem about the current meta too. If you think of it as being a game that has to rely on individuals, League of Legends that is, if you want to be able to snowball games, then in the competitive scene, it isn't something you can do right now because of, as Shadowvisions mentioned, that you just want to have an AD carry your team. If you want to see more solo kills, we have to go back to a game state where it's more about assassins or at least early game junglers, because right now, as Shadowvisions said, you don't see that because of it being so much easier to team fight and actually get objectives off of that.
Right, and we're also seeing that the metrics of what a good solo laner is no longer how good you are individually, but more how do you set up plays with your team. Can you hold control of mid lane priority, because that is what allows your team to get objectives. And can you coordinate with your support, with your jungler, to make roams happen and dives on the bot lane or top lane turrets?
Yeah, I also think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we have a lot of champions that, sorry, basically get almost as much out of their kit while being easy than champions that are like very hard to play, and basically mastery isn't rewarded. Being a perfect Azir is just barely like today with the Azir.
It's better now.
With the Azir, but it's like barely better than being a Syndra, but just pressing R basically. So the question is, should we go to a point in the game where these high skilled champions are rewarded more, or should we put balance above skill in this sense?
I think balance above skill would be the way to go. I believe that League of Legends at this point in time is more about having a fair competitive scene than actually looking more towards solo queue. So it also depends quite a lot on what the current philosophy is in the game. As you mentioned, you can be a perfect Azir and go up against a perfect Syndra and then win out just because you are the Azir. The philosophy right now is that you want to be able to teamfight, and therefore picking teamfighting champions is the way to go. So you have to think about the way that the game is approached, and approaching the game right now is just being able to teamfight better than to solo kill your opponent or look to assassin the enemy Caitlyn in the bottom side.
Exactly, and it's much easier to play Janna and press E on your AD carry in a team fight and press R when the enemy jumps on them, then actually execute a high mechanical assassination play. And this is actually a point that I thought you would bring up, which is that the highest win rate champs in both solo queue and competitive right now, unfortunately, are champions like Janna. Sona is wrecking solo queue. It's not even funny. Malzahar has one of the highest win rates in mid lane for solo queue, but you don't even see him competitive. He's just so easy. And I think the highest win rate champs in solo queue will always be non-interactive because it is so hard to make mistakes and lose your team the game on them, right? If you have something that's mechanically intensive, you're going to have these bad players trying to learn the champ and cost their team the game because they don't know what they're doing. What I would like Riot to continue doing is rework these outdated kits to have more expression of skill. Mm-hmm. They tried to do that with the recent Janna changes. With every rework, they try and make non-interactive champs like the old Galio or Warwick into more interactive champs, and most recently Evelynn. Seems like all of these champs will have more expression of skill. Some of them are still made to be easy, like Galio. New Galio is still very easy to pick up, but you still have to coordinate roams with that champion. You still have to coordinate, where's the enemy jungler if you're playing Warwick, and communicate with your lanes. Hey, I can gank here. Is this guy low on health? I'm coming. So there's definitely a lot more expression for skill, and I think when they get to all the supports and make them, a bit more interactive, I think balance over skill is definitely the way to go with League.
All right. So the question then obviously becomes: do we want to go to this like more skill-oriented state of the game, or do we want to keep it down? Because obviously that is gonna mean that League of Legends, that League of Legends has to become more volatile overall.
I'm not quite sure I understand what you're saying, Luis.
It's basically if you can have a high impact with singular big plays, the game becomes very volatile. Would you agree?
I wouldn't necessarily agree, because I think that it's harder to snowball the game right now. You don't see a Syndra set pop off like you did in Season 3. And therefore, I think it's good for the overall state of the game to be able to get a few kills and then work together with your team to then snowball that lead into something else. You have to keep in mind that League is so much about these trade-offs. It's so much about being able to, trade one kill in the mid lane for something else, and then getting that gold from a kill or solo kill, let's say, gives you something that you don't have to give something up for. And therefore, then you can snowball that into something with your team. Just keep in mind that League of Legends is so much about working with your team. You can't solo carry like you can in, let's say, a game of Counter-Strike, where everyone is equal in terms of power.
I think the other way to interpret this question is, should snowballing be buffed? Because that would obviously allow for more individual plays to impact the map. So that's kind of how I interpreted it. I think the answer is, if you look at the current meta, yes. But it is a very slippery slope when you adjust the snowballing amount. Obviously, from Season 3 to now, Riot has slowly edged in the direction of team play over individual skill in terms of snowballing. So when they add these snowball mechanics like First Blood Turret, which is something they did to make it go the other direction, and I thought that was a really good change because it prioritizes the teams that make that first early play and look to make a kill. Same thing with First Blood. The first kill is worth a little bit of extra gold. And I think having some of these snowball mechanics in the game is very good. Rift Herald was another one. If you get that objective early, if you have priority over that objective, it can lead you to a turret, which can be difficult, and it counters the wave clear meta a little bit because you can't wave clear Rift Herald, you know? So it definitely is a little bit still there for the snowballing, but it's just a dial needs to be cranked a little bit back to snowball, but not much. Otherwise, you risk back going to Season 3, which, while it was exciting, it was not necessarily the healthiest for the game.
No. And to add on top of that, I also believe that right now the game is actually in a fine state in terms of competitive gameplay, but in terms of solo queue, it's not very good because you still have to get to the late game before you can really end. I feel like, because it's so hard to end a game as a uncoordinated team. In solo queue, you don't talk with the guys that you play with, and therefore ending a game prior to the 30-minute mark is going to be so hard. And if you get to the 35-minute mark, the enemy team will then have 3 or 4 items because of them being able to turtle and actually get resources back into their hands, that they can then make that comeback because of you not being able to end the game. And I feel like that should not happen in terms of solo queue, and therefore I do agree with Shadowvisions that you need to turn up the snowballing scale just a little bit, make it so that it's easier to end the game. With that being said, it would also probably bring back these early game junglers, the Lee Sin, which I think would be fine for solo queue.
Do you think you could maybe remedy that, like have the game still be not as volatile as in Season 3 if you would basically crank up the rubber banding mechanics but make them more skill dependent, like the way bounties are, but the way that catch-up experience definitely isn't?
Well, the thing about snowballing right now is also that Riot, they have created this atmosphere of having to play together as a team for so long. It's basically been something that they've been aiming for the last 3 seasons, making it so teammate oriented. And I think that it's going to be so hard to snowball because of this. So even if you do get a few kills and perhaps go 3-0 in your lane, yes, you'll be able to get your Morellonomicon or your Infinity Edge faster, but you won't really be able to snowball unless you work together with your team and they are prepared to actually work together with you.
It is absolutely a team game above all else, and I think that is fine. I think it is good that Riot has decided that, you know, in order to win League of Legends, it cannot be a solo effort. Your team has to be better on the whole than their team. Obviously, the area where that breaches is solo queue, where you're not a team at all. So solo queue can be pretty disastrous in terms of that, but I think competitive, having the better teamwork win is okay. The problem there is that if we go back to the very first points we made, where it is more difficult for an individual player to stand out in terms of their mechanics rather than their ability to roam and help the rest of the map. That's a teamwork activity. The individual outplay is obviously your mechanical skill. So it's very delicate, but if they nerf some of these, like Ardent Sensor, AD Carry is the king meta, I think it will naturally go back to some of that more balanced state. And I think the world's meta is just kind of an anomaly in terms of that.
All right. So still, I don't think you really addressed my question. Like the question is, could you crank up snowballing mechanics if you cranked up basically catch-up mechanics and made them more skill dependent.
Yes, I believe so, because you were taught to balance equations in algebra in middle school. You have snowballing and catch-up on both sides equal. If you multiply them both by a scalar, I don't think it would be that great for the game. I think it's better, instead of impacting the numbers, to add more mechanics on both sides of the equation. Rift Herald here, First Blood Turret over here, a little bit of catch-up XP here. It's better to add more stuff that you can play around on your chessboard of League than necessarily just up the gold value of snowballing.
Yes, I completely agree with Shadowvisions. I do think that just adding more mechanics to the game would be a way to perhaps add a little bit more snowballing to it. I think that they did a good job of it when they changed Rift Herald, making it so that you could get towers, because that is a way to get gold for a team and then actually try to snowball. I remember back in the days when Dragon used to give you gold. And that was also an item, sorry, not an item, an objective that gave you quite a lot of extra power to try and snowball. And I feel like that Riot, they have made this game into more of a team-oriented game. So it would be very hard to necessarily do so that it would be easier to snowball. But there are ways of doing so.
All right, so kind of to have like a bit of a theory craft here. I want to ask, how could we make getting back into the game more skillful? Because just getting handed XP, just getting handed gold through lanes, of course, that's a way to balance the game, but that's not a way to make it really that fair. So the question is, what could be more skillful variants there?
I think that's a hard question, because then you would have to try and change the overall state of the game. If you want to make it more snowbally, you'd have to perhaps change Drakes back to giving gold, or perhaps make them more about snowballing, so that you don't have something that gives you mana and health regen, but instead perhaps gives you let's say a skill that can perhaps hit your enemies or something like that. Just whatever, some kind of offensive power would probably be the way to go if you want to give more snowballing back into the hands of people. Objectives is one way to go, and then changing champions is also the way to go. And I think that it would be very, very hard to change the game back to being more snowbally if you don't want to change the overall identity of the game.
So I think the easiest way to go about that, as you mentioned, would be changing champions, because otherwise you have to fundamentally change how Riot has catered the game within the last 5 seasons since I've been playing. So if you change champions, you don't have Janna Lulu anymore that outscale by default. And the reason why it's so easy to catch back up right now is because Riot made the minion waves push if you have an advantage, right? So you don't have to do anything. You have to rely on your wave clearing defense, and you have to rely on the enemy not being able to do their job. So I think it is kind of it's okay to expect the enemy to be able to snowball advantage, but it is also a little bit unfair, because the onus is on the team that's already winning to close out the game. Otherwise, the game is even. I think it would be nice to have the enemy team that is behind have to make some plays to come back in the game. And I think the easiest way to do that would be to add more expressive kits to champions like Janna. You already see in Worlds, when you have Rakan on your team, you're 10,000 gold behind. You land one the quickness, and you kill everyone. That is a very skill expressive way as a team that you can actually come back in the game. So I really like that that's an ability for teams to go for. They can show that, hey, we may be down, but we're still the better 5-man unit. We can still team fight very well. So I think that'd be the easiest way to make it come back.
To add, sorry.
You
want to go, Luis?
Yeah, please. Just
yes.
Because I have a point exactly to that. So, the only thing I kind of have a problem with that is landing an Orianna, a big Orianna ult is not really the problem. The problem is having people walk in the way to have a 5-man Orianna ult. So so the question is that more of an expression of skill, or is it just exploiting the opponent's mistakes then?
well, to win a game is to exploit the opponent's mistakes in a way. Like, obviously, if the enemy plays it perfect, you can't come back in the game. That's how how it should be. Because if you already have the lead, both teams play perfectly. The team that has the lead should win 100% of the time. Right? If we're just talking in theory. So, I don't think it's a problem to say if you can't land a massive Orianna shockwave, not because you're a bad player, but because the enemy team is playing it correctly, that's them snowballing their advantage just fine, and that's optimally what you would want in a game.
All right, now Jesper.
Yes, I have a completely different perspective on all of this, and I think that making the game more snowbally would also be very hard because if you don't change the fundamentals of the game, because we are in season 7 and everybody knows how to approach split pushing, how to approach Baron dancing. You don't see that a lot anymore, and therefore it's so much harder to snowball the game. I remember back in season 3 when I used to play Draven, I also played quite a lot of Tryndamere, and it was so easy to just split push every day, all day, because people, they wouldn't know how to approach a split pushing Tryndamere. So with all this knowledge that people they now have, even in solo queue, it is so much harder to actually work together. It would be so much harder to snowball because of people knowing how to deal with, let's say, a Riven that's 3-0, or a team that now is able to do a Baron because of people knowing how to deal with those things.
All right. So one crazy idea I had, and this goes back to the theory crafting, and I just wanted to bounce that off of you. Get good elixirs back. Basically, have an elixir mechanic where you can spend money as if you're, for example, if you're ahead to try and snowball, or if you're behind to get back into the game. Have a window of opportunity where you're even with the enemy team and try to make a play. Do you think that would work?
So like an experience elixir, or just power in
basically just stats that boost you, that could boost you,
like the current elixirs, but maybe a bit stronger and more diverse.
Yeah, basically, so you for a short amount of time could stand up to the enemy team while putting your gold on the line, basically saying, all right,
it's a wager.
Yeah.
Yes.
Would that work?
But cheaper, like we used to have, right? If I remember correctly, yes, we used to have Riven being able to start a
red pot.
Yes, red pot.
Right.
I don't necessarily think that would mean that the individual skill would come back into League of Legends. I do believe that it would give you the edge over some opponents, but again, people are so smart about how they play nowadays. Obviously, some people are still not very smart in solo queue, if I have to put it pretty. I still believe that people, they know how to play the game more or less correctly, and even if you do have than in the past, and even if you do have a red pot, while it would give you that small advantage, I do believe that you would be shut down very fast, because junglers would be able to recognize that, hey, we have a guy up here that didn't start with, let's say, a cloth armor and stuff like that. You wouldn't have that extra stats coming from your cloth armor or your Dorns, and therefore people would know that they could shut you down because of you starting such a risky start.
Right, but I don't think he means at the start of the game. I think he's talking about when you're already behind.
Okay.
You can buy one and kind of level out the playing field for a little bit of time, because it does eventually expire. So I actually think this is a decent idea. Something else I think this could also be applied is boot enchantments. I think that'd be cool to bring back. Lets you kind of diversify your boot choice, and that's something that every champion buys. So you can kind of pick some individual stats on your champion that don't really delay your core build too much. And if you couple that with the elixirs, you can, instead of just slowly bleeding out and losing the game, you can buy yourself one chance to actually come back as a team. And I like that idea. I think it'd have to be carefully implemented to keep it balance tuned, but I think it could definitely allow for some more interesting things other than the team that's ahead. And as long as the other team doesn't have Ardent Sensor and a better scaling comp, automatically win. So I do like that idea.
Like it'd have to be, you'd have to make sure that a team that is ahead couldn't just buy it and get Baron for free, for example.
Yes.
Okay, well, with that in mind, I do believe that we also have to get into a different meta in order for that to work. But I do see the the painting that you're creating right here, Luis, and I could see it work as well. I have to agree with Shadowvisions that it would be very hard to balance out because if you are, let's say, Twitch that just went down 10 CS and 1 death in your lane, and then you do get that red pot, being able to get that and then completely be even with a Jinx or whatever that you're going up against would be a little bit unfair to me, because then that would mean that you would then be perhaps ahead once you've gotten a few kills or won a team fight. So it would be hard to balance, but I like the idea, and I think that it could be something that could work out. You just have to really balance it because you are already able to do so, but 500 gold is just a big chunk of your gold and a very risky buy.
And I think that's fine, but I think it would have to be better communicated to the other team that if you make elixirs to that strong, if the enemy has a potion that kind of gives them an advantage, the enemy team needs to be able to see this in a way that's not click on the enemy champion and look at their buffs, right, in order to play around it properly, because it is a bet for the team buying the elixir. The other team needs to be made aware of that bet in order to properly play around it, and from there the team with the better skill expression actually comes out on top, because you can play around it, back off, not take the fight with that red pot, and then that's you playing it well. On the other hand, the team with the elixir has to force something. So if both teams are aware of it, and they can start to play to those individual win conditions, and that's where you can see some more skill come out in terms of being behind or playing from ahead.
All right. So for the last topic of discussion, I kind of want to look to the future and look at Runes of Forged and ask, does this how does this relate to individual skill? Do you think the more individual expression of the Runes Reforged will bring out more skillful play?
I think that the new runes will obviously make it so the people they have an easier time, or at least a more easier opportunity to go for these offensive early game plays. But then we also have to keep in mind that obviously it will also be easier to play as a tank. So I think the new runes will be very much affected by this meta that they are in.
So you think that basically runes will change everything and nothing?
I think that there are some runes that Riot they have proposed that will be super strong and very broken. But I do also believe that when talking about runes, you have to put it into a context of what meta are we in. Are we looking at tanks? Are we looking at assassins? Because some of them, they will be broken and they will be meta shifting to begin with, I believe.
All right, my opinion is that we have to skip past the first 6 months to a year where it's a balancing nightmare, and you get to the point where it's the dream of Riot game balance team, right? It's perfect, everything is right. And if we look at this in a bubble, we can kind of see that this is better for the game. You can have a more customizable skill set for your champion, and whether or not that changes the meta, I think even if the game state is still the exact same, it will feel better to the player to be able to select their individual play style a lot more, right? So even if it doesn't change snowballing or individual impact, it will feel better to the individual player that they're being able to play to their strengths and shoring up their weaknesses, and it'll allow them to, kind of play more around what they pick in their runes. And I think that's a lot more skill expressive than necessarily outscaling or building Ardent Sensor.
All right. Do you think, we kind of had the same theory with the Keystone Masteries, but ultimately it just turned out that there was a perfect way to play or the wrong way to play, basically. So do you see a potential there?
I think. Oh, go ahead.
No, you go, Shadowvisions.
I think they're trying very hard to avoid that, and I think that the magnitude of the amount of runes they're making, some players will decide that they will look up closest Korean build. Did they win? Build that rune page. I think that's fine, but I think the idea is it's balanced properly. There's only 9 options for Keystone. There's 60 different runes, if not more than that, right? So every player will have something that they want, and if they're balanced to a decent degree. I really hope they get to balance to a decent degree, which is obviously the goal of the balance team, is that it will be more impactful than Keystone runes. We've seen this before. They rework masteries and runes every season. The reason why it is the entire preseason is because this is a massive undertaking by the development team, and obviously they realize, they learn from the mistakes, that if you just change one season at a time, do little changes to the runes and masteries that are locked behind, IP, and so people want to buy with IP, they can only afford, one set. It's going to have to be the best. It's going to have to work for every champion. It's a more economical investment. Now, since they're open to everyone, people are free to experiment besides just at the top level of play. And I think we should and would see some more innovations out of Runes Reforged, and that's what I'm really hoping to see.
Yes, I agree again with Shadowvisions. I believe that as long as they are decently balanced, it will be basically a thing about who can find the right style for themselves. Because if they are decently balanced, nobody will just copy Reckless or Amne or whatever. They will look for what fits them the best. But if they are terribly balanced, they will just go for whatever the pros are going for, because that is the easiest way to go. Especially that's what we've been seeing the last few seasons, that, well, lifesteal's been the primary way to go in AD carries, so everyone will go that. So we'll have to look at how they balance it out.
Just remember Thunderlords on launch, and that's all.
Enough said. Exactly. If they don't balance it out correctly, something will be stronger, and people will go for what's stronger, because obviously that gives you the opportunity and the extra amount of power to win games.
All right. So Shadowvisions, any closing thoughts on this?
I have one more point for discussion that kind of relates to this. Do you guys think that the weakest link is more impactful in games than the strongest link? And if so, what could Riot do to change that in terms of the game?
It kind of depends. Like, I think sorry, give me a second.
Are we talking in terms of competitive play or solo queue?
I think
your choice.
I think at the highest echelons of competitive play, you can definitely play around your weaknesses. I mean, Longzhu, religiously sacrifice Cuz on the altar of the League of Legends gods every game, and still come out ahead due to their individual, due to their great players overall. So I do think you can definitely work around your weaknesses, but basically, if you're not consciously, that's the word, consciously aware of these and play around these, I think there's definitely a way that your worst player can mess up your entire game. Yes.
I also believe that when talking about both solo queue and competitive play, that in solo queue it's so much easier to abuse the weakest link and then snowball off of that, because if you can let's say take away the top laner, then obviously people will play 4 versus 5, and then you have this window of opportunity where you can just play together better as a team and win over your team because of you having that man advantage. But when looking at competitive play, you have to look at, well, who's the strongest link and who's the weakest link. Is your strongest link your mid laner? Then it's so much easier to play around him if you have a strong jungler to go with that. But if your weakest link is a support, you might want to go down there, because the weakest link will then also affect your AD carry. So it quite heavily depends on the situation, but most of the time I would say go for the weakest link, because your strongest link obviously is a strong link and can just work on its own.
All right, Jesper, any last thoughts on this this discussion?
I believe that the game is in a very healthy state now. I don't think that you should go and touch too much on the way that the game is played right now. I would like to see more diversity in terms of what can be played, but I overall do believe that the game is very healthy, and we shouldn't see too much snowball, because individuals, they can still work out for their own. You have seen Rox Tigers as a team work together work really well because of the individual power that they bring to the table.
I agree. I think that once Riot finally gets around to allowing more champions into the meta, allowing more compositions to compete with this Ardent Sensor AD carry meta, the actual way that the game plays out is fine in terms of what they've done to make it more team-oriented. I think that is the best way to balance the game, is to make it a team game, because it's not just 1v1, it's 5v5, and obviously teamwork is a crucial part of any team sport, especially in real sports. So definitely agree.
All right, let's end it on that cautiously optimistic note. My name has been Louis Berman. I've been joined by Jesper Benvarmeren Kunz and Tyler Shadowvisions Deaton. You can find their Twitter handles in the description. I'm going to link them there. Any final words?
Well, I've been happy to be here with two very handsome guys. That's all that I have to say.
Thank you. Yeah, good to be here as well. Thanks for watching, everyone. See you next time.
Exactly.